Good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome from the Federal Agency for Civic Education at our discussion, Trump Through the Looking Glass. My name is Katerina Mishchenko. I am a so-called program officer for Ukraine at the Federal Agency or Bundeszentrale für politische Bildung, and I am a moderator of today's discussion. Also, I am the one of our team whom you see tonight on the stage, but I was not alone who prepared the event. At this point, I would like to thank my colleagues who are partly here, Konstanze Söder, Heike Winkel, Christina Menke, Hanna Žetinec, Katerina Stecevich, and Isabel Schöpner, as well as our host partner, Peter Roman, and the whole team of Taz Kantine. Maybe you saw there we have a book, a so-called book table. There you can see our famous publication series of the Federal Agency. And here we prepared for you the books and other publication related to our topic tonight. So you are free to have a look and take some informational materials if you prefer. Another thing from my side goes to our interpreters, Dorothee Schechter and Carola Gard. If you need a German interpretation, by the way, of our discussion, since we are speaking in English tonight, please take the headphones if you need it. And probably the last big thing is given to our speakers, Jakub Majmurek and Jan-Werner Müller, who are a guarantee that we will learn a lot about right populist learning process and how to resist for the sake of democracy. Let me introduce our speakers shortly. Jakub Majmurek is political journalist, film and art critic from Warsaw. He writes for numerous media outlets, including Poland's largest daily newspaper, Gazeta Wyborcza, also Aspen Review, the film magazine Kino. He is a member and editorial board of Krytyka Polityczna, a left-wing, actually movement, but officially a think tank, publishing house, and online magazine, one of the biggest online magazines or daily magazines in Poland. In addition, he is commenting on current Polish politics and also writing about new social movements in Europe, and parallel writing about movies, about film, and about arts. And this is a very interesting combination to analyze today's political trends. Jan-Werner Müller is a political scientist and professor at Princeton University. He is known for his work on democracy, populism, and constitutionalism. And his book, What is Populism, actually published 2016, was and is a bestseller, translated into many languages. Unfortunately, still very relevant and actual. And now he is working, or just finished probably, his book on architecture and democracy, and will be published by Zokamp Verlag next year. Jan-Werner Müller is also known as a public intellectual, since he is giving comments on political processes and participating in international public debates and writing for German media, of course, but also for The Guardian and the London Review of Books. Thank you very much for being with us tonight. And since I've mentioned the book, What is Populism, I want to tell you a story, how I prepared for today's discussion. I was watching an interview with you, Jan-Werner, and it's already 9 years ago as you gave it. And we are still talking about populism, about rise of the far right, and interestingly and unfortunately, the same names, or partly the same names, are present in these talks. I mean Vladimir Putin, I mean Viktor Orban, Erdogan, Trump, Kaczynski has disappeared, but maybe not really. No. Yeah, so I was thinking we are like talking about it and here listening to the talks on populism for a decade at least. And now I think we can say that it became not a regional but the international, a global trend. And I want to ask you what is the state with this trend today? And you, Jan-Werner, told already 2016 that these different right-wing populists are learning from each other. So I want to ask both of you, how does it look today with this mutual learning, and what kinds of forms of learning, interaction, and looking from each other developed in current time?
Okay, so I may start, and maybe I tell something about how this Polish right-wing populism is learning from its international counterparts, especially from the MAGA movement, because I think that what is interesting, if you ask me what has changed in Polish political right in this last 10 years, it is not necessarily that it became more populist. It did, but it's not the most interesting development. But the fact how it became kind of MAGA-pilled and how it turned itself into a kind of a local franchise of the global MAGA movement. When Andrzej Duda, the former president of Poland from Law and Justice Party, was winning 10 years ago, he was winning like a local populist who was mainly mobilizing people by speaking about their particular problems. Karol Nawrocki, who won the presidential election that year, defeating liberal centrist Rafał Trzaskowski, won as a kind of local trade representatives of this global MAGA franchise. Before the second round of Polish presidential elections, we had CPAC conference in one of Polish cities. A lot of people very prominent in the American MAGA movement, like, for example, Jack Posobiec, came to Poland to agitate from Nawrocki, including Kristi Noem, who is Secretary of Homeland Security in Trump administration, who said straight that Rafał Trzaskowski is a socialist, but he was trained he's a trained leader who is dealing in fear, and generally, maybe without speaking it in that words, she endorsed Trzaskowski as a representative of Trump and his administration, which is something unprecedented also in Polish-American relations. You could guess, for example, that the former administration of Biden wasn't very sad when Donald Tusk became a prime minister and the government in Polish changed, but never before we had that straight endorsement from one administration to the particular Polish candidate, an endorsement based of political vicinity between these two movements. And you can see how Polish right-wing politicians are even trying to portray themselves, for example, in social media as a kind of fighters of MAGA. They are very often photographing themselves in MAGA merchandise, in hats with MAGA slogan. They are very often starting even to run their social media in English and to give voice in the American debates. Some of Polish politicians, like a member of European Parliament, Dominik Tarczyński, actually went to states in November 2024 to campaign among Polish Americans in order to encourage them to support Trump. And you can also see that Polish right-wing is generally able to rationalize any Trump decision as good for Poland. However, he can be soft on Russia, however he can behave towards Ukraine in the way which might be also not very friendly to Polish interests, the Polish right is able to rationalize it, it is trying to convince everyone that Trump is playing some extremely sophisticated geopolitical chess. If someone doesn't gets it, it just means that he doesn't get the genius of President Trump. But also a lot of, for example, culture war topics are directly translated into Polish context. It happened before. Polish right was very often inspired by the American right-wing cultural movements, for example, especially anti-choice movement. But now you can see how the issues which completely didn't exist in Polish public debate like 3-4 years ago, like for example transgender persons' rights, suddenly are becoming a hot topic, and how the right-wing influencers, ideological entrepreneurs, authors or politicians are parroting the same discourse of the cultural words from behind the ocean. And I also think that the conclusion which the Polish right-wing took from the victory of Trump, and this is something which is very visible in politics in all three Polish right-wing parties, because now actually in Poland we have three right-wing populist movements, and three of them quite strong. The biggest one is Law and Justice, this party of Jarosław Kaczyński, which is the most traditional among this and old generationally and in terms of their electorate from this populist right-wing parties, but it is also very strongly MAGAfied and very strongly invested in being a local franchise of MAGA. There is Konfederacja, the party which has now around 15% in the polls, which is kind of the party of young men in their 20s and especially 30s who are extremely pro-market and who are kind of inspired by Trump, but also by this kind of the Tea Party republicanism, small government, Ayn Rand, or by this wing of MAGA movement, which is connected with Elon Musk or Peter Thiel. And there is also the third party, which polls now around 5 or 6% of Grzegorz Braun, the party which is openly anti-Semitic, anti-Ukrainian, pro-Russian, anti-modern. Grzegorz Braun, who is the leader of the party, declares himself as a monarchist, despite the fact that there is no pretendant to Polish throne. He is openly hostile to democracy, especially liberal democracy. So all these three right-wing groups, I think, took the conclusion from the second victory of Trump that the time of moderation in politics has definitely ended. But there is no point of going to the middle, of fighting for the moderate voter, because, as a former education minister in the peace government said, the moderate voter doesn't exist anymore. And this is something in which Polish right is very strongly invested, and this is the conclusion they took from the victory of Trump. It is going to be seen if it is the right, it is a correct conclusion you could take from the victory of Trump, if indeed the moderate voter doesn't exist, and if that Trump and Republicans wouldn't be punished very severely, for example, in midterms, for their lack of moderation and for the fact that they didn't deliver on their promises. But this is now the conclusion that the Law and Justice took from the victory of Trump. And I also think that in Poland, when we are observing what is happening in the US right now, all this vindictive politics of Trump, weaponization of Justice Department to go after his opponents, after people like Comey or John Bolton, of attempts to undermine the judiciary or legislative, we have this feeling that if, or the pessimists would say, when Kaczynski is going to return to power, we are going to experience the same, that the Americans tried to stop Trump, they succeeded for 4 years, but he returned, and he returned with a vengeance, and in an even more extreme version of the self, and we have this feeling, kind of this feeling that we are next in a line. So
maybe in the same question for you, Jan-Werner, but with an additional one. Does this import from the US to, let's say, Eastern European political regimes, does it work vice versa? I can tell you one example. It's probably more the cultural one. The American historian Marcy Shore wrote about this new Trump era in the US, that she has a feeling, since she is a historian of Eastern Europe, that the post-Soviet 90s are now in the US. And I am wondering if it's always like import from a big power to smaller Eastern European or European countries, or it works also in another direction.
Allow me to answer your previous question very briefly with 3 points and then turn to the new question. So the word trend that you used earlier conjures up the image that has probably been most prominent in commentary and analysis of our era. The image of the so-called populist wave, or as Nigel Farage, for whom apparently the image of the wave was too small given his own world historical role, as he once put it, the populist tsunami. I think there are two problems with this widespread image. The first is that it's empirically very dubious, and the second one is that it's politically very pernicious. Let me try to briefly explain what I mean. Plenty of surveys have shown that this idea that every day around the world, people wake up in the morning and say, from now on, I want to vote for right-wing populists, is simply not plausible. If you just look at the European scene, and I'm referring to work by a former colleague, Larry Bartels, who already 3 years ago brought out a very important book with a telling title, Democracy Erodes from the Top. He argued that if you look at opinion surveys on issues like migration, refugees, the Euro crisis, there's no evidence that public opinion has decisively shifted in a direction that would work well for populists. At the same time, you will now rightly come back to me and say, but wait a minute, I look at these elections, something is happening. You can't just deny that these parties are being more successful. It's true, of course, but the explanation that Bartels and others have offered is twofold. First, plenty of these parties are able to appeal to voters who actually didn't vote at all before, but who held right-wing extremist attitudes. And all of a sudden, there's a party that appeals to them. Maybe you can think of an example. Beyond that, and this will no longer surprise you, plenty of center-right actors, plenty of center-right parties in the last couple of years have basically legitimated far-right populists, have basically told their own voters that these aren't dangerous figures. These are people who talk about real problems, who even sometimes speak for the people. Once you've done that, you obviously cannot take it back. Just to give one brief example that I found particularly striking, in the 2022 presidential election in France, Valérie Pécresse, the candidate of basically the Gaullist party, so as mainstream as it can possibly get in the French Fifth Republic, gave a speech where she basically more or less said that the conspiracy theory of the so-called Great Replacement, you all know the idea that basically nefarious liberal elites are sending Muslims to Europe to replace the real population, that there might be something to that. Big scandal. She kind of tried to take it back. But once she had told all her nice bourgeois voters who think of themselves as perfectly mainstream that there might be something to that idea, you can't really take it back. So this is an important explanation of what's been happening, and it goes against this notion that there is a wave. Because once you say wave, let alone tsunami, in a sense you're also saying inevitable. None of us can stop a wave. Certainly we can't stop a tsunami. But the more this image circulates, and this is the second point, the more also center-right figures are going to say, there's nothing I can do. This is a global trend. You know, I'm not going to stop a wave. I'm going to have to adjust to the wave, maybe ride the wave. I mean, can't really ride a tsunami. But you can at least ride the wave, perhaps, if you're a good surfer. So it's, in a sense, it had really bad consequences because at least some social scientists and, alas, plenty of journalists are constantly telling center-right elites, basically, you have to adjust to the times, the populist times. So that was my maybe overly pedantic, quick remark about this image of a trend. Secondly, I think it's worth reminding ourselves that, yes, if you look around the world today, especially if you look at what for shorthand you might call populist regimes, they look very similar. The way that, to mention just some of the folks you had mentioned at the beginning, the way Orban, Erdogan, Modi, Trump, plenty of others talk and act is very similar. It doesn't follow that the reasons for their rise are identical. People like to think this because, to be fair, even though we always say, oh, populists, they're the great simplifiers, and we are trying to understand a complex world, let's be honest, we would also love it if somebody could give us, a global macro cause of this development, ideally in, 140 characters or maximum 280 characters. The usual discussions: is it economic? Is it cultural? Very often, of course, code for refugees, migrants, and so on. My point is, it ain't as simple as that. The fact that you find all these similarities is not conclusive evidence that the basic underlying cause is identical. It's precisely evidence for what you are pointing to, which is that plenty of these actors are learning from each other. And oftentimes, it's not difficult to learn. One person pioneers a law that you can weaponize against NGOs. Somebody else reads the law and says, sure, let's declare them foreign agents. Let's try to confiscate their resources. That's not that difficult to do. So we have a kind of transnational learning in terms of, I was going to say best practices, but of course you may as well say worst practices in terms of what aspiring autocrats can do. Thirdly, just very briefly, of course, there has also been now a long-standing discussion about, an international of populists, or it's sometimes put, an international of nationalists. And inevitably, somebody says, oh no, that can't happen because that's a contradiction in terms. You can't have an international of nationalists. I think that's wrong. There have been plenty of internationals of nationalists in the past. Just think back to 19th century Europe. Think back to, broadly speaking, liberal figures like Mazzini in Italy, who basically said, yes, we're all nationalists, we're all fighting against empires, we all believe in national self-determination, and we're all helping each other to liberate our brothers and sisters in other countries from more or less evil empires. And nobody said, oh, this is totally incoherent, this cannot possibly work. Having said that, the real question is, of course, sure, they talk the talk. They, as you rightly pointed out, they now do go to other countries and basically issue recommendations for voting. And if Mariam Lau, in her biography of Friedrich Merz, is right, then Vance, in his Munich speech in February, you recall, was basically planning to endorse the AfD. And then somebody told him that maybe that was not a good idea, and he took it out. But of course, what he said more or less sounded like an endorsement anyway. So that is new. But the real question, I think, is to what extent is somebody willing to make real sacrifices? Or to what extent is it just talk? And my hypothesis, and maybe some of you want to come back to this later if you like, at this point would be that there's no willingness to really sacrifice. Unless there is some strong material interest behind it. In the case of the US, you could say that, yes, for Vance, it's been real because he's helping American tech companies. When he says, oh, Europeans hate freedom, or, he didn't put it quite like that, but basically says, they don't believe in free speech anymore, they can't say what they want to say online. Of course, that's the agenda of his big Silicon Valley allies, who don't like what the European Union has been doing in this regard. The same with what Trump has been doing in Latin America. They also didn't like what Brazil was doing in terms of regulating social media platforms. So they really tried to help Bolsonaro. And as you all know, more recently, there have been very strong material interests behind the push to help Milei in Argentina. So in other words, I think if you can combine this sort of international alliance with real interest behind it, yes, something happens. But I wonder what's going to happen next year to Viktor Orban. If he really does lose, which some people think might happen, it's not obvious what the material interest is. And yes, maybe Trump will lament, this outcome, but I wonder whether anybody will truly do anything. Now, what was your real question again? The post-Soviet 90s, yes. So look, clearly on one level, the answer is yes. It's not just, oh, here's the powerful US and everybody else is adapting and learning from the US. This is, if I may say so, sometimes what Americans think. They also, for a long time, basically said, oh, now there's populism in the US and now everybody else is imitating us, Le Pen and so on. And then, pedantic comparative politics scholars said, actually, the other guys were first, and you are imitating them. And this is, maybe difficult for, a certain kind of narcissism that you find in the US, that it wasn't America first, but clearly, things started elsewhere a long time ago. And very concretely, and this can always sound a little bit like conspiracy theory, but alas, it's true. If you think about the famous or maybe infamous Project 2025, it was very clear that they were learning from Hungary in particular. And again, this can sound like conspiracy theory or who was meeting whom, etc. But it's really very clear that this is partly what happened, but also with important differences. Last point I'll make, if I may. To some degree, the American actors have basically copied the strategy that some of our colleagues call autocratic legalism. And Orban was a kind of pioneer of this. You basically do something that looks very legal on paper, you follow the procedures, nobody can immediately say, oh, this was obviously criminal, or you're obviously breaking the law, but the results are basically the consolidation of autocratic regimes. Poland, of course, different because they didn't have enough of a majority to change the constitution, but Hungary could do it. And in the US, they were clearly trying to imitate this because they spent the 4 years between Trump 1 and Trump 2 trying to find sometimes extremely obscure laws, including 18th century laws, where they said, if we use this, this is going to give maximum power to the executive. And this is what we're going to use, and this is what we're going to do, and this is what they've done. But they've also done something that is different from these earlier examples in Europe and Central Europe in particular. And this is that, and this is not news to anybody in this room, Trump has also done things which are very obviously illegal. It's basically Trump acting like, the businessman version of Trump in the 70s and 80s in New York. You do something that everybody knows you're not really supposed to do. But you create facts on the ground once you've done it. Other people will have to react. He can wait. Are they going to settle out of court? Are they maybe going to cave? It basically provides a certain advantage if you do things this way. Orban couldn't do this, because he had to care about fooling the European Commission into thinking that democracy and the rule of law still existed in Hungary. Do the United States care about so-called international public opinion? Well, you all know the answer. Do they care about international organizations? Do they care about, somebody at the UN said, there's a problem here. So in that sense, Trump has been much more unconstrained, because that sort of external constraint on certain practices hasn't been there. So some part is learning, and some part is indeed a re-importation of certain practices that were first developed in Central Europe. I think we can have a separate discussion about to what extent the kind of mafia state they might be building is similar to what Putin was trying to develop. But it's also different. So in that sense, it's always worth listening to people who say, oh, I recognize this. It's like Erdogan. It's like Orban. At the same time, one pedantically always has to add, yeah, but it's never going to be quite the same. And these national differences, last pedantic point, really also do matter.
Well, to add maybe to that, I think that if you listen to the MAGA people, you can see that they are really admiring Orban Hungary. I've seen an interview with J.D. Vance some time ago when he was asked about universities, and he said that Orban is practically the only politician in the West who managed successfully to deal with what J.D. Vance calls a problem of the left-wing bias in academia, and who was able to put into life some kind of measures which are able to create a counterbalance to it and to end the hegemony of the left in the universities. Trump is often admiring Orban as a strongman and talking about him in a very, very warm words. So you can see that there is that this inspiration is somehow real. You've said that Trump has less restraints than Orban. It isn't true, because I think that Orban was also able to get through the Hungary as he did, because Hungary is a relatively small country, when you have only one big city, when you don't have very strong and very competitive group of elites which would be able to mount a successful challenge to Orban, it is quite simple to build a crony oligarchic capitalism with a small country, with a small upper class, with just one truly big city, one in the country such diverse, with such a broad and divided ideologically, politically, but also in terms of its material interests elite. So I think that yes, Trump naturally doesn't have this external constraints that Orban had, but from the other hand, United States, it's far more difficult to dominate. At least I have this impression internally that Hungary was a country with only one big city, with when Orban was basically able to rule by ignoring Budapest and basing his power on the support from the countryside, but he was able to control. To gather almost whole control over the economy of the Hungary in the hands of his cronies. I'm not saying that this is impossible to do in the States. Definitely, this is something which Trump would like to do in the States. But I think that it is maybe because of the size of the U.S., diversity of the U.S., a bit more difficult.
If I may, just one point to that, because I think there's an interesting point for German audiences in there. So I agree that it's easier in a very centralized country. That also means it's easier in a country that doesn't have federalism. And as probably you all know, right now, for many people in the United States, federalism is sort of the last hope in terms of saying this creates a structure where you at least have some focal points for resistance, where you have some legal measures you can possibly employ. Historically, it's an interesting reversal, because for the left and liberals, federalism was always very suspect. It was basically the thing that protected racist practices in the South from the federal government. Now things are flipped around. Now you say, well, this is actually maybe the last best hope. A lot of the relevant actors are constantly talking about strategies in terms of resisting the federal government. And the interesting thing in the German context is that, as you all know, our eternity clause in the basic law, so the parts that can never be amended, no matter what kind of majority you have, of course, doesn't only contain human rights and democracy, but also federalism. And maybe some of us remember voices where people said, come on, federalism. If Bavaria were to disappear tomorrow, okay, less folklore, but also not Markus Söder. So, you know, what's the problem? And now you realize that the mothers and fathers of the basic law, you know, saw something incredibly important. That if you know, push comes to shove, you want to have these structures. You want to have official decentralization as something that gives you a foothold if you need to push back against aspiring autocratic actors.
Thank you. I wanted to go back shortly to this image of tsunami. I think there is something in it, since we know that tsunami has this rollback moment, yeah, and destruction. And this is also a process which has to be considered if really this kind of destruction or dispractice, as you told, is happening, then it's really hard to work with consequences, since some politicians or some regimes are not elected anymore or are losing their power in some other way. Yeah, but it was just a remark. But probably not really, since the tsunami is also a wave. Sorry, I am very much interested in waves and waters. Is not coming once. Usually it repeats. That's why it's important, if you are going up from the tsunami, stay there, because the second wave will come. And this is my picture and my bridge to the issue of comebacks, which we had in the US and in Poland. And the political scientist Ivan Krastev is speaking recently about post-populism. And I wanted to ask you both about this wording and in general about wording, since you told trend is not good. Okay, we have post-populism as a word, but even when we were preparing this announcement, we were asking ourselves how we are describing these poles, right-wingers and pro-democrats, anti-pluralists, right-wing populists or just populists, and is everything what we are discussing like the same right-wing populism or the same populism, or do we need also other words and to be more precise, and how does it look now with this post-populism?
Well, I think that definitely what we can observe is a visible crisis of the mainstream traditional political parties. And it is visible in every democracy. If you look at the United Kingdom, we were talking here about Nigel Farage, and for a long time, British democracy, due to its electoral system, seemed to be the most immune for any new challenges. Since 1920s, it was always conservatives or Labour, more often conservative than a Labour in that last 100 years. But now when you look in the polls in the United Kingdom, something absolutely incredible is happening. Not only Reform Party seems to be on the first place, but you can also see the surge of the Green Party. And you can ask yourself in the next election, I am quite skeptical to this take, but this is something worth thinking about. We are not going to see the new realignment Reform Greens, because you can see that both the Conservatives after 14 years in government and Labour after just 1 year in government are in extremely profound crisis, and especially Labour, which is attacked both from the right by Reform in its more working class district and from the left by Greens, and also possibly Jeremy Corbyn party if it managed to constitute itself, which is now quite doubtful, in its more urban, more metropolitan districts among more educated voters. And you can see this crisis in France, when also in the system which seemed for a very long time very stable, very resistant to any challengers, you have completely paralyzed parliament, which is not able to create the stable government majority. And even if Emmanuel Macron would declare tomorrow, okay, it is not working, I am leaving the office, let the French decide, they would probably decide once again in that manner that they wouldn't be a clear majority to push the France in one direction or the other. So I think that this is this very profound and very visible crisis, and the rise of right-wing populist anti-systemic parties from the one hand, but also from the other hand, with new initiatives on the left. If you think, for example, in Germany, what was the biggest surprise of the recent federal parliamentary election? Was it the result of the AfD? I wouldn't say so. It was something I expected. But for example, I was really surprised about how Die Linke, the party which seemed to be so weakened by the secession of Sarah Wagenknecht, and which the pundits were thinking if it would be able to get through the threshold and have any kind of parliamentary representation, surprisingly make quite the okay result, looking at the point of start of our campaign. So I think that this is something which we can observe, and it can manifest itself when these waves, which are in which are once time raising right-wing populists. Sometimes these are anti-systemic leftist parties, and I don't know, maybe not in the UK, but I wouldn't be that surprised. And for example, in the next presidential elections, the French would be faced with the choice between candidate of the Rassemblement National, probably not Madame Le Pen, because she was punished with this ineligibility and she can't run, and Jean-Luc Mélenchon from France Insoumise. And it would be very interesting development from the future of the Fifth Republic. Probably it could be the end of that system and the beginning of something new. Not necessarily a system which wouldn't be any more a liberal democracy, but definitely this whole system designed by General de Gaulle back in 1950s may not survive that kind of a development of the political system. And yes, due to this crisis, the right-wing populists are returning. Trump returned in the US, and I think that still the Democrats don't know why it did happen. There are many discussions. Recently there was this report which claimed that it was because Biden administration moved too strongly towards left, but there are, from the other hand, voices from the left that Biden administration wasn't sufficiently populist. These elections which took place in Tuesday are also kind of confusing. We don't know how the Democratic Party should it interpret. Should it follow the road of Zohran Mamdani, or rather more centrist governor-elects of Virginia and New Jersey? So Trump returned, and I think that in Poland a lot of people are expecting that in 2 years, when we are going to have new parliamentary election, the right wing will return to power, but this time it wouldn't be only Kaczynski, because now Kaczynski is too weak to think about ruling again anytime in the nearest future. Ruling alone again, he would have to make the coalition, for example, with this hyper-libertarian, hyper-free market, Elon Musk-inspired Confederation Party, and with the President Nawrocki, who won as much as a candidate of peace and of this younger, more Musk-inclined right. It would mean that Poland would move to the right even more than it did, and more away from liberal democracy than it did in 8 years between 2015 and 2023.
3 points. I'll pick up your challenge again about trends. Here's another attempt to persuade you not to talk about trends. I think it's become a real issue that almost everywhere in Europe, election commentary and analysis is exhausted by the question, is populism advancing or is populism retreating? And very often with real misrepresentations as a result. 2 examples. When Meloni won in Italy, people said, oh, another triumph for populism. Nobody cared about the fact that Salvini was declining massively at the same time, and that actually the right bloc as a whole was weaker than in the previous election. But that didn't make for a good headline. Of course, it made for a much better headline to say, is fascism back, ? The same with the most recent Dutch elections. You know, the only question was, is Wilders up or down? But that wasn't the only question on the table. You know, other right-wing populist parties are on the scene. Again, you saw actually a fair bit of stability. And we don't see this if all we do is fixate, you know, on one great populist leader and we ask, are they up or down? So again, forgive the pedantic point. Secondly, in terms of what happens in a post-populist moment, I think one maybe obvious issue to have on the table is simply that there are some democracies who can basically meet the challenge of having a previous incumbent who did something illegal, and there are some who can't. So Brazil and South Korea were able to deal with presidents who, let's just say, had done something illegal, and were able to take them out of the political game. It didn't mean that their parties had to be banned. It didn't mean that, you know, people who have certain preferences are no longer allowed to voice those preferences and to vote for candidates who, you know, might represent the best bet for advancing them in politics. But the specific individuals who had done certain things were basically in a sort of version of individual Während, Demokratie, so not taking the party out, but taking the individual out, were dealt with. And we all know what the counterexample to this is. In terms of, you know, why did 2024 happen? Well, partly because people could look around and say, oh, everybody keeps telling me that Trump is so bad, but, you know, they still haven't really convicted him of anything. Seems he's actually okay, so maybe I'll vote for him again. And on the more general question of post-populist challenges, maybe it's also worth, I mean, you will know this much better than I do, But I think given that maybe Poland is now the most prominent example, where basically you feel, okay, they really surprisingly lost power, but then what do you do in terms of addressing the system that has been changed by them in the meantime? And I'll only say one thing because I want to defer to you and your expertise, but there was an interesting recent analysis which suggested that you might face what these particular political scientists called a trilemma. What did they mean? They said you can act quickly, you can act effectively, and you can act legally. But you cannot have all three at the same time. So if you do it quickly and effectively, it's not going to be legal, and so on. So you see what I'm trying to say? There's a real issue in terms of how do you do this under these circumstances. And again, that's different from, okay, there was one bad, presidential actor. That's a different challenge than, okay, somebody has truly changed the system. One last footnote to this, since you also asked about our use of political language. So it really matters a great deal. Remember the insight from Hannah Arendt that political judgment is basically the ability to draw distinctions, not to always mix up things which are really very different. So it does matter a great deal how we talk about populism, extremism, authoritarianism, all these things. My view happens to be that precisely, again, because so many pundits and journalists and sometimes politicians keep telling us that we supposedly live in the age of populism, we stick the P word, the label, on all kinds of phenomena for which we actually have much more precise concepts. Protectionism, racism, nativism, all kinds of things, which are really different from populism. Populism, at least in my view, is simply a political leader or party saying, we are the only ones who represent the people. But that's not about content. And something like far right is about content, is about nativism, is about hating foreigners, is about wanting to close borders. But you can be on the far right without being a populist, and you can be a populist without being on the far right. And then finally, as you all know, we also now have a very lively, sometimes for many people, a very hurtful discussion in the United States about fascism. And I think it's worth saying that there's certainly elements now in terms of what the Trump administration has been doing and how they communicate what they are doing, the memes that the Department of Homeland Security is putting out there, for instance, where it's hard not to conclude that, yes, the celebration of cruelty, celebration of humiliating people, inflicting violence on them, that's not populism. And that's also not just the far right. Saying far right is kind of too tame, it's kind of too harmless, because you can say actually that has clearly at least echoes of fascism.
Yeah, I'm thinking this creating of images of cruelty is also a level of, is kind of a message which is also can be the tool of learning. And since you can see such pictures in the US, you as a politician in your country can imagine or start thinking about how to realize something like this in the other country. I want to tell you one little story and then ask the question. A couple of days ago, the German Chancellor Friedrich Merz told that actually it would be it's time, since there is no war in Syria, to send people back, especially deport those who are criminals and start deportations. And interestingly, I read it in Russian media, that Kirill Dmitriev, I don't know if you know this figure, he is one of the negotiators between the US and Russia. He is born in Kiev, actually, and working for Ukrainian oligarchs, then moved to Moscow and making big consulting for like super big international firms. And he is one of these like semi-formal negotiators now, and with Trump team and Kremlin. And he tweeted about these words, about the statement of Merz, and he wrote, finally, Merz started reading our posts about immigration leading to Western civilizational suicide and taking some action. Hope that he follows other advice as well. Of course, it is now like a speculation from my side to tell, yeah, there is some interconnection or something like that. But on some level, like if we are speaking about fantasies and deportation, brutal deportation, which is sometimes filmed, yeah, it's a visual event, became kind of, yeah, image, I don't know if we can say there is a kind of trend, but it is quite international, yeah? And it is taken into the agenda of new emerging programs before some elections or during, yeah, we can see it also on the example of Ukrainian refugees, how the image of them changed in Poland, is used from time to time in other countries, and it is a bit shifting in Germany as well. And I wanted to ask you about this, like story. What do you think about these traveling images, which are quite brutal, let's put it this way? And my other question would be, but let's not speak very long, the event, I don't know, of war. On the one hand, our real war in Ukraine, the war in Europe. On the other hand, these ideas of war in the US. On the one hand, we have someone who is dreaming about Peace Nobel Prize. On the other hand, this person is planning invasion to Venezuela and is planning to rename the Ministry of Defense into the Ministry of War. So what is this interrelation of war, right-wing populists, right-wingers in today's
many points here, but maybe I just referred to something which Jan-Werner said about this problem with incumbent who broke the law, because Trump was actually sentenced for one crime, for this falsifying of election records. It was this case when he used his campaign money illegally in order to pay a former porn star in order to silence her and not talk about the intimate relations which she had with him. But I don't think it hurt him. It's one thing to pass a sentencing, to get the sentencing card. The other to convince people that this is something which is disqualifying. I think that many of the people in Trump movement regarded all these legal problems of the president as a form of a law firm waged by the Democratic administration, and there are even voices that it might strengthen Trump. But in Poland, there is this other problem. There is this problem that peace introduced a lot of changes which had the constitutional character without changing the constitution, and it was impossible for the new government of Donald Tusk to reverse these changes. And you've said about this trilemma. I think what the basic problem was that there was a president from the Peace Party who had the right to veto, because in Polish constitutional system, all the law which is passed by parliament can be vetoed by the president, and parliament needs the majority of 3/5, 60%, to overturn this veto, and the current government doesn't have that kind of majority in parliament. Usually governments don't have them, so this veto of the president is usually pretty decisive. And the whole tactic of kind of dismantling of these changes of peace of the current government was based on this assumption that in 2025 there are presidential elections, and Rafał Trzaskowski, as a candidate of this coalition of Donald Tusk party, is winning this election, and this barrier disappears, and we would be able to reverse all the changes which were done by peace. And this tactic failed to work out because Trzaskowski lost the election. There is a new president from Law and Justice Party who is even less willing to compromise with Tusk government, and I think that there is no clear idea how to change, how to prepare a new strategy for that situation. Not long ago in Poland, a journalist published a book which is kind of a chronicle of his electoral campaign of Trzaskowski, and he asked one of the politicians who worked in his campaign, did you make any kind of a plan B for the situation if Trzaskowski loses election? And he answered to him, are you making plan B in the situation if a mine would tear up with your legs? So they were completely mentally unprepared to the scenario when they can lose, but they did. And coming back to this question about deportation, it is true that this is another thing where this populist or right-wing movements are learning from this other. I know that AfD also had this idea of remigration, and that it was played in the German politics, in British politics. There is this. It is now in the program of the Reform Party, at least the deportation of all these migrants which came in the recent years, and all the people who are trying to illegally cross the border also in order to seek the asylum. And I think that generally, if you look at the politics in Western democracies, you can see that not only the parties which could be qualified as hard right and right-wing populism, but also mainstream parties are taking more and more unforgiving position towards migration, towards refugees. The voices that maybe this whole human rights system protecting asylum rights is outdated and needs at least to be very significantly revised are coming from the liberal medias like The Economist. There was the article in The Economist not so long ago calling to radically reform that system. And this is also, for example, the line of the current Polish government of Donald Tusk, who is advocating for the reform of the international law regarding refugees, because this government believes that this law is weaponized, for example, by the gangs of the smugglers. It is used to facilitate illegal immigration, and it needs to be radically challenged, because we can't be prisoners of the naive human rights philosophy, of naive idealism, which fails to see how the reality is working. And I'm afraid that this is the direction in which the political mainstream is going to move in the recent years. Maybe not in that extreme form as Trump ICE policy, because I don't know if at the end of the day it is going to be beneficial for the Republicans, but towards this safe position, this soft position that maybe this whole rights of refugees are a bit outdated and needs to be reworked. This is going to be the line of the political mainstream in Europe, in my opinion.
So yes, images of course matter a great deal, and they can circulate globally very easily, as everybody knows. You might also say sometimes they can be a little bit ephemeral. So maybe I could also highlight another aspect of what right-wing populists in particular have been doing in the last few decades, partly with a view to creating strong symbols and images. They've gotten very, very interested in architecture. And if you think about how Erdogan has changed Turkey, think of his presidential palace, think of the gigantic mosque that you can see from almost anywhere in Istanbul, think about how Orban has built on the Castle Hill in Budapest, think about how Modi in India has done things with Hindu temples to send a certain message. That is also part of it. And I think it's partly, and that actually does, I think, connect really specifically to populism, because very often these buildings contain a message about who the so-called real people are, what is our true national tradition, what do we truly stand for, and who doesn't truly belong, who is alien, whose layer of history maybe needs to be removed. So in the case of India, let's say Mughal Empire layer has to be removed. In the case of Hungary, a state socialist layer has to be removed, and then something else is built on top. And beyond that, it's simply an expression of power. It's simply, memes on the internet might be, might be coming and going. But once you've built something that ostentatious and big, it's a message to your political opponents, look, we did it. and we really defeated you, and this is now here permanently. And what are you going to do about it? So I think that's a relatively undervalued aspect. I leave people in the room to draw their own conclusions about things like Garnisonskirche in this city. But I think compared to other forms of image making, I think that's something that we should certainly pay more attention to.
It's interesting how my both speakers avoided the war question. But not short statements, please.
Maybe you were closer to the US, so maybe you will tell us if Trump is going to war.
No, I don't make predictions, especially not about the future. But what I think is the most worrying phenomenon is that, yes, as you are hinting, somebody who was actually liked by at least some commentators on the left who said, oh, but at least he's ending the so-called forever wars. He's the opposite of neoconservatives. He doesn't believe in regime change, etc. Now we have plenty of evidence that maybe it wasn't quite as simple as that. Marco Rubio, of course, is a quite traditional neoconservative in all kinds of ways. So we'll see. But maybe the more interesting and frankly very worrying development is the reshaping of the American military itself. The fact that you had this purge of high-level, very, very qualified people who were deemed insufficiently loyal, that you used the military as props for your propaganda videos, where basically, as you all know, the soldiers are in the background to applaud you. You make the military partisan in a way that really hasn't happened before. And you also introduce, again, this sort of cult of violence. If you listen to the Secretary of Defense, this emphasis on so-called lethality and the warrior ethos, I would have thought many people in the military are very uncomfortable with this. Partly, if for no other reason, than it sort of conjures up this strange image that in the 21st century, a warrior ethos is kind of hand-to-hand combat, where you kind of, go mano a mano with the other guy, and then you hopefully kill them, and that's lethality. When, as everybody knows, that's actually not exactly how war tends to unfold. And we sometimes, last thing I'll say, have a sort of idealized image of the 70s and 80s when we think back to a supposedly it was a golden age of democratization, there's no question about it. But then when we think about the lessons, we sometimes forget that one of the lessons at the time was the military is going to play an absolutely crucial role. And if it doesn't go along with the transition might simply not happen. And for me, always a very striking example of this that I think is virtually forgotten is 1988 in Chile. So people remember that Pinochet basically said, I'm going to have a referendum. Do you still want me or not? He loses, of course. The no wins, and the rest of is history, except not quite. Because what is, I think, totally forgotten is that Pinochet was actually willing to stay in power, was ready to declare an emergency, do everything it took. And it was one general who basically went in front of the press and said, we recognize we lost, that's it. And then it was very difficult to reverse that dynamic. So it can come down to one person in a military leadership in terms of which way is it going to go. And against that background, what is happening right now in the United States is extremely, extremely disconcerting.
I don't want to take time of your question, but I have questions. But I have to, since we need to be optimistic in terms of optimism of the will. Can you tell us what could we do, what should we do, what has to be done, in your opinion, quickly?
Now you left with that question.
It's a very loaded question. I think that it depends on the country, it depends on the situation. It is maybe a good idea not to give up completely and not to give up at the beginning. And it is also important how, for example, the institutions are behaving in the middle of this populist takeover. I think that the most Trump would be pushed back by the institutions he's trying to subject to his will, the more difficult it would be to him to actually realize this Project 2025 template and urbanize America. And I don't know. I think that maybe it is very interesting what has happened in these recent elections in US. Of course, we were only in blue states. It does not. It would be very presumptuous to take any conclusions from what has happened on Tuesday regarding, for example, midterms or regarding the future of American politics. But maybe there is this possibility that people showed that they voted for something different than when they voted for Trump, and the fact that this different populist extreme right-wing parties are still quite short, and were always short of truly fulfilling our agenda, is also something uplifting. Peace in Poland had almost the full power for the 8 years. They had they controlled the legislative. They had the majority in the Polish Sejm. They had their own president, who almost didn't use a veto without few exceptions. They managed to take the control over constitutional court, which was also rubber stamping everything, absolutely everything they did. Nonetheless, considering how great power they were able to concentrate in their hands, they were quite short of doing what they planned to do. They were good in destroying the existing institution and on installing chaos with them, but not necessarily in terms of building new system. Orban was far more efficient than Peace, but maybe this efficiency also came from the fact that he was operating in a smaller country with a smaller and less diverse elite, when this institutions or which could resist him, like for example, rich, strong, big cities, were much less numerous and much weaker than in Poland. So yes, there is maybe always a bit more hope that we think that it is.
There are a million things to say. I'll just confine myself to one point. This is obviously not just a PR problem, but of course communications matter. And since we kind of touched on this, by now it's pretty clear that when, for instance, now again, centrist pundits say, oh, social democratic parties, must focus on providing jobs and stop running after obscure minorities and policing language and so on. You want to say to them, what do you think the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States was? It was precisely, bringing a lot of resources, a lot of money to red states, create jobs and clean energy on top. They simply couldn't communicate what they had done. Meanwhile, Trump not maybe Trump personally, but the people who advised him, was very good at reaching basically people who almost never vote, but who all of a sudden became discovered as a potentially very powerful constituency. And in that sense, I don't want to be starry-eyed about anything, but the Mamdani campaign has been an amazing experience. Maybe the best, or close to the best I've seen in my lifetime. Maybe it helps if your mother won the Golden Lion at the Venice Film Festival and you have that kind of background, you really know how to do this. But it's clearly, it can be done, is the optimism of the will part, which you asked us for. So there you have it.
Yeah, it was really like radical inclusiveness. And this is, I think, the lesson some social democratic politicians have to learn, and not to learn from the right-wingers all the time in order to make a good political campaign. Thank you so much. And now we are open for your questions, dear audience, and you are free to choose the language. If you prefer, you can ask in English. If you prefer German, Jakub has to use the headphones and will respond to you. Wait a sec. We will give you the microphone.
Thank you. I would just like to know what is Madani. I didn't hear it. What does it mean, Madani?
Madani is the person who just won the mayoral election in New York City.
Ah, yes, of course. Yeah. So that gives us hope, right?
So suppose I'm a political strategist and I want to achieve global hegemony for the democratic parties of the world. Earlier you mentioned that, for example, CPAC had a conference in Poland with which there was some collusion between these two right-wing parties, or at least right-wing movements, or you've seen J.D. Vance stop just short of endorsing the AfD. Should the democratic parties of the world then start fighting fire with fire and doing the same thing? Does that lead to change? Can I ask the second question? Is that all right? Yes. So the second question is, earlier, Jakub, you had said that in Poland, or at least you had quoted somebody who had said that in Poland there is no moderate party anymore. But if I look at right-wing populism has been around in its current form for maybe about a decade or so. And we've had some time to see as it has ebbed and flowed and ebbed and flowed. And have we seen an equilibrium, or will we see, what is the long-term vision for how this might turn out? Thank you.
Well, I think that I was more telling that it was the conclusion of Polish right wing, that there is no more moderate voters. So, and this is what they are doing. So I would say that maybe there is no like moderate right in Poland anymore. And what would be the long-term consequence of it? It is impossible to say. I think that definitely we may see some kind of transformation of the party systems in Western democracies. These party systems which are still in place were developed in completely different contexts, and just as the political system based on the opposition between conservatives and liberals were in 20th century replaced in most of continental democracies by the political system based on the opposition between some form of Christian democracy or more conservative than Christian Democrat center-right and some form of social democracy center-left. Maybe we are going to experience the new realignment, and it doesn't necessarily to be the new realignment in which the prominent role is played by the parties intending to completely dismantle the liberal democracy and replace it with something much less sympathetic. And to your first question about this international of democratic parties, I think that to some degree it is happening. For example, in Polish campaign in that year, Rafał, on one of the rallies of Rafał Trzaskowski invited the winner of the presidential election in Romania, and this presidential election in Romania were also kind of this liberal center of Romanian politics was able to defend itself from the right-wing populist challenge was closely followed in Poland, and this winner appeared in one of Trzaskowski's rallies, and definitely also left-wing or centrist or liberal political parties are learning from each other. I think that this Madani campaign is going to inspire really a lot of politicians, especially urban politicians, especially, I don't know, prospective mayors, the same as, for example, Obama campaign also inspired many centrist liberal politicians in Europe, or as, for example, I don't know, on more far left 10 years ago, it seemed that parties like Podemos and Syriza have the answers, and they have some new forms of party organization. So this process is happening. It is just not as effective as the case when MAGA is learning from Orban and, for example, Polish right-wing from MAGA.
Okay, 3 quick points in response. First of all, you might know more in terms of empirical evidence, but my sense is that these endorsements don't matter necessarily a great deal. And in a sense, we've seen a particular show once before. There was a brief moment in early 2017 when Trump was endorsing Geert Wilders, when he was endorsing Marine Le Pen, and it kind of backfired because Trump was actually not very popular in Europe. It's actually also not very popular in the United States, but that's a different story. So I'm not sure it matters a great deal, really. And if anything, of course, it invites, a pushback. Who are they to meddle in our elections and so on. But second point, more structural, I think it is a problem that in the EU context, we have these supranational party families, like European People's Party and so on. But if you look at the actual regulations, it can be very difficult for individual national parties to help other parties. And of course, we have these supranational families, but de facto, it all still breaks down to national parties. So you can't vote for the EPP in Germany, you have to vote for the CDU. And there, I think, you could make real changes in terms of, yes, if let's say one country is under pressure from an aspiring autocrat, if others could do more, that might really make a difference. Last quick point in terms of what can one learn from the far right. We can have a long discussion about Charlie Kirk and Turning Point USA. But I think one thing that always struck me was there was a really successful method of creating a certain kind of communal experience. And you can call it a festival, you can call it something, where people sort of got together in physical space and they looked at each other. It's not a new idea. If you maybe think back, if this isn't too highfalutin, to Rousseau saying, if you want to have a successful revolution, if you want Poland to really work as a nation, you have to have lots of festivals. So people constantly get together and they engage each other in a certain way. They dance together, they do stuff. And I think maybe some on the, let's say, very neutrally more liberal side of things have not been very good at this. I can't think actually of very many examples where you would say, yeah, that was a real event. That was a real experience where people kind of were strengthened in a sense of solidarity or optimism of the will or even of the intellect. So I think that actually can matter a great deal. It's not just all about the internet, it's these reunions in physical space that can often make a big difference.
Hatten wir. Nach dem Korrektivartikel. 100.000 Millionen.
Ja, ich wollte den Begriff Äquidistanz ins Spiel bringen. Selbst hier in den Räumen der Taz, die Chefredakteurin hat ihn schon mehrfach verwendet auf Veranstaltungen, also die Chefredakteurin. Und zwar, ich will das am Beispiel, als dann die Wahl war, bei der ersten Wahl zu Trump oder Frau Clinton, da haben doch etliche in dem Mitte-Links-Block der Demokratischen Partei doch gemerkt, mit diesen herrschenden Demokraten oder in der Mehrheitsmeinung der Demokratischen Partei, da war bei vielen, auch Intellektuellen, eben im Gegensatz zu der Kampagne während des Wahlkampfs und zur Obama-Zeit und des Wahlkampfs doch eine breite Unterstützung, richtig bis in den Kulturbereich. Und die hat bis auf Ausnahmen doch deutlich nachgelassen. Und da war auch ein Interview in dieser Zeit vom Magazin Der Spiegel in Deutschland, nämlich mit Oliver Stone, einem bekannten Filmemacher, Jurassic Park und so weiter. Und der Reporter hat dann auf die Frage gestellt, wie er wählen würde, Clinton oder Trump. Und da sagt er, weder noch, obwohl er noch zu Seiten der Obama-Geschichte da eindeutig Ja gesagt hatte. Und dieser Begriff Äquidistanz, wenn also die auf jeden Fall ablehnend sind, zwar gegenüber Populisten, aber in der Frage, wenn die Herrschaftsmeinung, die herrschen, dann entsprechend so ein Stück weit, und er hat das deutlich gemacht am Beispiel des Libyenkriegs und das Verhalten Hauptsache, dass Gaddafi weg muss. Und das Resultat war dann im Endeffekt desaströser als vorher, mit Gaddafi. Ich will damit nicht sagen, dass ich ein Stützer für Obama bin, aber das war für ihn, und hat er noch andere Gründe genannt, aber mir geht es darum, wie würden Sie das bezeichnen in der Situation, wenn viele Menschen zwar grundsätzlich, auch hier in Deutschland, also mit AfD nichts zu tun haben wollen, aufgrund auch der historischen Verantwortung, dass sie dann zu den jeweiligen Polen dann eine gewisse Äquidistanz bis hin Wahlenthaltung und sich da raushalten wollen. Also dieser Begriff Äquidistanz.
Danke. An dieser Stelle möchte ich fragen, hat noch jemand Fragen? Wir sammeln jetzt. Oder nicht? Dann... es gibt
Ich habe noch eine Frage zu Polen. Welche Rolle spielt die Diskussion über Reparationen? Ich habe den Eindruck, dass also jetzt aus der Sicht hier aus Berlin, von allen Parteien geteilt wird. Ist das so?
Mich würde mal interessieren, weil das nicht so meiner Ansicht nach vielleicht so rausgekommen ist, so wie muss man sich oder sage ich andersherum, wenn man sich die Situation in den USA ansieht, der S&P 500 läuft gut, Inflation bei 3%, die Zentralbank hat die Zinsen gesenkt, Trump hat die Steuern gesenkt, die Europäer oder die Firmen, beispielsweise die Pharmafirmen in der Schweiz, die wollen jetzt ordentlich investieren und die Preise für die Medikamente senken. Wenn man so als Otto-Normalverbraucher würde ich sagen, auch ist ja alles gut, was jetzt so der Trump geschaffen hat. Nicht? Ich kann mich wieder fühlen als ein Amerikaner, nicht? Das auserlesene Volk Gottes auf der Welt. Oder wie Clinton schon mal sagte, it's the economy stupid. Von daher ist doch eher so, dass viele Wähler so denken und sich sagen, ist doch schön mit dem Trump.
Okay. Äquidistanz, Reparationen, schön mit Trump. Poesie des 21. Jahrhunderts.
I can go first with reparations. Well, this demand for reparations from Germany, it was always the political project which was kind of owned by Law and Justice Party, which is the more anti-German or at least kind of Germano-sceptic of the parties in Polish political system, which comes from some personal prejudices of Jarosław Kaczyński and from the structure of this electorate. Law and Justice is the party with a lot of voters in their 60s, 70s and older. This is the bulk of their electorate. These are the people who were brought up by the generation which experienced the Second World War and still might have some anti-German resentment. And Kaczynski was playing it very cynically through all his political career. He was always, for example, framing Eurosceptic arguments as anti-German arguments. For example, now he has this line, he told it on the last Congress of Law and Justice Party, which took place like 2 weeks ago in Katowice. He said, for example, that from one hand we have Trump, who might be a bit difficult ally, Kaczynski is far more skeptical towards Trump than politicians of his party, especially the younger generation. But from the other hand, Trump doesn't want to take from us our statehood. And this is what Germany wants to do with Poland. This is what France wants to do with Poland. In case of French, Kaczynski said, I don't know why France wants to do it, but apparently they do. It means that he knows perfectly well why Germans want to do it, but French he can't understand. French people he can't understand. And this is what a European bureaucracy, as he called it, wants to do it. And this talk about reparation is part of this anti-German rhetoric of Kaczynski during the when Kaczynski had the power in the years 2015-2018, the governments put the special task force which prepared a report about Polish material loss during Second World War, and this task force presented this report which calculated the amount of reparation which Germany should pay to Poland. And from the other hand, this second big Polish party, Civic Platform Party of Donald Tusk, was always presented by PiS as pro-German party. When Jarosław Kaczyński, when PiS was at power, public television, which was then controlled by PiS, very often was showing Donald Tusk in the main edition of the news program of Polish television, when he was talking at some German conference and he said this word, für Deutschland. And if you've watched the Polish television in the year 2015, 2023, and if you turn on this main news program, it was very, very probable that you could find Tusk saying these words, für Deutschland. Very often there was only this clip which was shown to prove to everyone that maybe Donald Tusk is not actually a truly Polish politician, but the German one. And this is generally the line which PiS was seeking against Tusk since like 2005 when he was running in presidential election, and when Jacek Kurski, who was kind of this spin doctor of Jarosław Kaczyński, found out that the grandfather of Donald Tusk, who came from Gdańsk, was actually in Wehrmacht, and it was this proof that Tusk is not sufficiently Polish because he had the grandfather in Wehrmacht. Later, of course, it turned out that he was conscripted into Wehrmacht against his will, but nonetheless there was this line. So Civic Platform, in order not to be pushed into this corner of pro-German party, is also saying that maybe reparations in the strictly legal term, in the strictly legal sense of this word, are impossible to obtain for Germany, but we generally should demand some form of compensation. And they are saying this, I think, not necessarily because they believe that this is something doable or achievable in relation with Germany, but pushed by the dynamics of the inner politics. I also don't think, to be perfectly honest, that Kaczynski believes that reparations in the strict legal sense of this word are obtainable goal, but nonetheless he's been playing this kind of line in politics. If you ask Polish people if they believe that the Germany should pay some if not reparation in the legal sense of this word, then some form of the financial compensation for the war, then yes, probably the majority is going to say that Germany should do it, and I think that this is the sentiment which is quite widespread in Poland. So this is how it looks. And to this two other questions, this equidistance, and the third was. Yes, it is good under Trump. I think that if you look at the approval rating of Trump, it doesn't look that the Americans are very satisfied with him. He's actually very unpopular, and his ratings are underwater in every area. Also, in terms of economy, most of Americans are not satisfied with the Trump economy, and at least this is what the polls show. And as for this issue of equidistance. I think that this is also, for example, what hurt Trzaskowski, that many people didn't necessarily vote for Nawrocki, but Trzaskowski lost because many voters who voted for these parties, which are now creating the coalition with Tusk, stayed at home because they find Trzaskowski campaign similar to campaign of Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton to be uninspiring. They thought that they are taken for granted. They thought that Trzaskowski believes that he deserves their votes only because he is not from Law and Justice, and they decided to stay at home. So this is definitely the problem of democratic liberals or center-left parties all around the world, especially if you put in front the candidate who is uninspiring, who is non-charismatic, who seems, I don't know, not necessarily very honest, and so on.
So on the issue of equidistance, two remarks. So I think you're right to say that there can be a legitimate complaint about a kind of blackmail that comes with the argument about you just have to choose the lesser evil. And if people feel that's always the message and they never get to kind of have more substantive input, it leads to justified frustration. Having said that, there are moments when you do, I think, have to choose the lesser evil. And you can still then afterwards work for structural change. We all know this is incredibly difficult in the United States, given all the incredible pathologies around campaign finance and plenty of other issues. So in that sense, I think it's a genuinely hard issue to tackle. But I take your point that this is something that is a real complaint. Allow me to add one other remark that is not quite about the same problem, but maybe worth putting on the table for your consideration. It's the phenomenon that is nowadays in the United States often referred to as reactionary centrism, by which people mean a sort of tendency to say, oh yeah, Trump is really bad, but the left on campus is also really bad. And so, you sort of end up legitimating Trump de facto, the same way that people ended up saying, oh yeah, Trump is a right-wing populist, but Bernie is a left-wing populist. And, it's a kind of odd situation to have these people. And the point is, of course, that these are not truly symmetrical situations. And I don't think there's a good word in German for reactionary centrism. Jürgen Habermas once spoke about zwanghafte Symmetrisierung. So you make things look symmetrical that actually are very, very different. And you either don't want to see that basically the power behind these phenomena is very different. The far right has a completely different power behind itself than three guys on a campus somewhere in the Midwest who might have radical views that you disapprove of, and you kind of pretend that these are sort of on the same level somehow. So I think that's worth paying attention to in terms of people basically failing to exercise proper political judgment in a certain way by suggesting an equivalence that isn't really there. Schön mit Trump, you've already said it. There are incredible levels of disapproval. The only thing I would add is that yes, the S&P 500 is the way that you said it is, but most Americans are totally disconnected from the S&P 500. So in that sense, what they would care about is how much are it's almost stereotypical now as the example, but how much do groceries cost? And that is very noticeable of what is happening with that. So I don't think it's so surprising that people are dissatisfied, and very generally, I think people also in principle do not like a perception that, okay, this is chaos, this is dysfunction. So the fact that it seems, it's maybe too early to tell, but the fact that the shutdown seems not to work in favor of Trump, I think is a sign that most people just don't like these things. And they tend to blame, the person who happens to be officially in charge. So in that sense, I think it may have also been a miscalculation. And the more now also this becomes a real issue in people's lives. You may have seen this news item today or yesterday that now the American army in Bavaria has to go to food banks. I don't think this is a winning strategy in terms of what kind of images you produce if you keep prolonging this situation.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your thoughts, and thank you for the attempts to be optimistic. despite of everything. Thank you for your questions and for your time. Thanks to the team and our beautiful interpreters again, and to Tatskantine. And now we can be grateful to each other and continue in the other room and have a short get-together. And have a nice evening. Thank you so much. And maybe let's switch the slide, and you are kindly invited to our next event, which is taking place in Berliner Ensemble. Welcome.